The invitation looked harmless. A polite phone call, a respected television studio, a promise of conversation rather than confrontation. Bob Marley had received many invitations like this before. Interviews where the smiles were practiced, the questions rehearsed, and the intentions hidden just beneath the surface. But this one felt different, too eager, too perfectly timed. The producers told him it would be light, friendly, a chance to introduce Bob Marley to a wider audience. Live television. Millions watching. What they didn't say out loud was what everyone behind the cameras already knew. This was not an interview. It was a setup. The host had built his reputation on ridicule disguised as wit. He never raised his voice, never openly insulted his guests. Instead, he laughed. He smiled. And with carefully chosen words, he made people look small while pretending to give them a platform. That night, Bob Marley was the target. When Bob arrived at the studio, the atmosphere confirmed it. Conversation stopped when he walked in. Crew members avoided eye contact. Someone laughed too loudly at a joke that hadn't been funny. Bob noticed everything. He always did. In the green room, the host passed by without stopping. No handshake, no greeting, just a glance that lingered a second too long, as if measuring something. Bob sat quietly, hands folded, eyes calm. He did not ask questions. He did not complain. But inside he felt it, the tension, the expectation, the quiet excitement of people who believed they were about to witness embarrassment. A producer approached him with a clipboard. "We'll keep it fun," she said quickly. "Just be yourself." Bob nodded. That was exactly the problem. The studio lights came on. The audience applauded on cue. The host walked out to cheers, confident, relaxed, completely in control. "And tonight," he announced with a grin, "we have a very special guest, a man whose music some people love and others don't quite understand." The laughter came. Right on time. Bob Marley walked onto the stage. He didn't rush. He didn't wave. He simply walked, steady and composed, as if he already knew how this night would unfold. The host welcomed him with exaggerated warmth, shaking his hand just long enough for the cameras to catch it. "Bob Marley," he said, smiling broadly. "Welcome." Bob returned the smile. It was gentle. UNBOTHERED. They took their seats. The first questions were safe, predictable, music, success, fame. Bob answered calmly, choosing his words carefully, never defensive, never eager to impress. The host nodded along, pretending to listen. Then, without warning, the tone shifted. "So, Bob," the host said casually, leaning back in his chair, "some people say your music is, well, a little rough for television." The audience chuckled. Bob remained still. "They say it comes from anger," the host continued, "from resentment, from people who feel left out." More laughter. The host smiled wider now, sensing momentum. "Would you say that's fair?" he asked. Bob looked at him angrily, not challengingly, just directly. The host held the gaze for a moment, then laughed it off. "I'm just asking what everyone at home is thinking." Bob nodded slowly. He said nothing. The host leaned forward again, enjoying the silence. This was usually the moment his guests stumbled, explained too much, defended themselves, gave him exactly what he wanted. "So tell me," he pressed, "do you really believe your message belongs on mainstream television?" The room felt smaller. Bob glanced briefly toward the audience. Faces filled with curiosity, skepticism, anticipation. They had invited him here to be mocked, to be reduced, to be turned into entertainment. What they didn't realize yet was this. Bob Marley had survived far worse than laughter, and the moment he decided to speak or not speak the entire balance of the room would shift. But that moment had not arrived yet, for now. Bob Marley sat quietly under the lights, listening, waiting, and letting the trap reveal itself. Asterisk, the host smiled as the silence stretched. He was used to this moment. Silence made people uncomfortable. It made them fill the space with nervous words. Apologies, explanations. That was usually when the real humiliation began, but Bob Marley did not rush. He sat still, hands resting lightly on his knees, eyes calm, breathing steady. The studio lights reflected softly off his face, but there was no tension in his expression, no irritation, no fear. The host cleared his throat, amused. "You don't have to be shy," he said lightly. "This is television. We're all friends here." The audience laughed again, a little louder this time. Bob turned his head slightly toward the host. "Not fully. Just enough to acknowledge him." "I'm listening," Bob said quietly. The words were simple, almost gentle, but something in the way he said them shifted the room. The host hesitated for half a second, then laughed it off. "Well, that's good," he replied, "because I want to understand something." He leaned forward, elbows on his desk, voice lowering into what sounded like curiosity but carried the edge of accusation. "Your music talks a lot about freedom, about systems, about oppression. But many people watching at home live comfortable lives. They don't see what you're talking about." The camera cut to Bob's face, calm, still listening. "So, when you sing about struggle," the host continued, "are you speaking for everyone? Or just people like you?" The words landed exactly where they were meant to. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. The laughter didn't come this time. Bob did not respond immediately. The host raised his eyebrows theatrically. "It's a fair question." Bob nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "it is." The host smiled, sensing control again. "And yet," he added, "your fans treat your words like gospel, almost like a religion." He paused deliberately. "Do you really expect television audiences to take that seriously?" A ripple of reaction moved through the crowd. Some laughed nervously. Others stayed quiet, sensing the shift from teasing to something sharper. Bob looked down for a brief moment, then back up. "I don't expect anything," he said. The host blinked. "You don't?" "No," Bob replied evenly. "I share." The simplicity of the answer caught the host off guard. He quickly recovered. "But surely you understand," he pressed, "that some people see your beliefs as extreme, unrefined, even dangerous." The word hung in the air. "Dangerous." The audience murmured softly now. Bob's expression changed, not to anger, but to focus. His posture remained relaxed, but his eyes sharpened slightly, as if something deeper had been activated. "Dangerous. To who?" Bob asked. The host laughed lightly, waving his hand. "Oh, you know, to order, to unity, to the idea that everyone should just get along." Bob considered this. "For a long time," he said slowly, "people told others to just get along, while they suffered quietly." The room grew noticeably quieter. The host shifted in his chair. "But this isn't a political show," he said quickly. "We're talking about music." Bob nodded again. "Music is conversation," he said. "Conversation is truth." The host forced a chuckle. "That sounds nice," he said, "but television isn't the place for sermons." Bob looked directly at him now. "I haven't preached," he said. The audience reacted, not loudly, but with a subtle wave of recognition. A few heads nodded. A few faces tightened. The host adjusted his papers, trying to regain momentum. "Let's be honest," he said, smiling tightly. "Some people think your image is part of the act. The hair, the language, the symbolism." He gestured vaguely toward Bob. "They think it's marketing." Bob's gaze did not waver. If it were marketing, he replied, I would change it when it became uncomfortable. The host paused. The silence this time did not feel playful. It felt heavy. The host leaned back, crossing his legs, trying a different angle. Do you ever worry, he asked, that people are laughing at you rather than listening? A few members of the audience glanced at Bob, waiting. Bob did not answer immediately. He looked out over the crowd now, scanning faces, young, old, curious, skeptical. People who had come to be entertained. People who had come expecting a spectacle. He turned back to the host. I worry more, Bob said softly, about people laughing instead of thinking. The reaction was immediate. Not applause, not laughter, just a sudden stillness. The host smiled, but it was thinner now, less confident. Well, he said, clearing his throat, this is getting very serious. Bob smiled faintly. Serious things usually are. The host glanced toward the camera, then back at Bob. Let me ask you one last thing, he said. Something very simple. Bob waited. If you had to explain everything you believe in one sentence, what would you say? The studio seemed to hold its breath. Bob looked at the host, then he looked at the audience. Then, slowly, deliberately, he said nothing, not yet. The silence stretched longer than television ever allows. In the control room, a producer shifted uneasily. Silence meant risk. Silence meant something might go wrong. A hand hovered over the button that would cut to commercial, but no one pressed it. Bob Marley remained still, eyes calm, posture relaxed, as if the silence itself belonged to him. The host forced a smile. Well, he said lightly, tapping his desk, we seem to have lost our guest. A few scattered laughs came from the audience. Uncertain and thin. Bob slowly turned his head toward the host. I haven't lost anything, he said quietly. The words landed without force, and yet they carried weight. The host chuckled, but there was a crack in it now. Then help us out, he replied. You've had the floor. The cameras are rolling. Millions are watching. Bob nodded slightly. Yes, he said, I know. That answer unsettled the host more than defiance would have. He leaned forward again, voice sharpening. Then speak, he said. Say something meaningful, something people can understand. Bob looked at him steadily. Understanding comes after listening, he replied. The audience stirred. Someone in the front row leaned forward unconsciously. The host straightened, irritation creeping in. You're avoiding the question, he said. That usually means someone doesn't have an answer. Bob's expression did not change. No, he said. It usually means the answer deserves respect. The host exhaled sharply through his nose. You know, he said, some people say musicians hide behind vagueness, that they like to sound deep without actually saying anything. Bob waited for him to finish, and sometimes, the host continued, silence is just silence. Bob finally nodded. Double yes, he said. Sometimes. The pause returned, but now it felt different. It wasn't empty. It was intentional. Bob shifted slightly in his chair, turning more fully toward the audience. The camera followed the movement instinctively, framing him in a tighter shot. He spoke calmly, without raising his voice. When a man is mocked, Bob said, he can answer with anger. When a man is misunderstood, he can answer with noise. The host opened his mouth to interrupt, but stopped. Bob continued. But when a man knows who he is, he said, he can answer with nothing. The audience reaction was immediate. Not applause, but a collective breath. Bob looked back at the host. You asked me to explain everything I believe in, he said. In one sentence. The host nodded slowly, uncertain now. Bob held his gaze. I believe, he said, that people don't need more words. They need more listening. The studio was completely silent. No laughter. No whispers. Even the camera operators seemed frozen. The host swallowed. "That's poetic," he said finally, forcing a smile. "But television moves fast." Bob smiled gently. "So does truth," he said. "It just arrives quietly." The host glanced off camera. Someone in the control room gestured urgently, mouthing, "Wrap it up." "Well," the host said, tapping his desk again, "we're almost out of time." Bob nodded. "I know," he said. The host hesitated, then added, "Before we go, would you like to say anything to the audience watching at home?" Bob looked past the cameras now, as if addressing someone much farther away. He took a slow breath. Then he looked back toward the host, not with challenge, but with understanding. "Yes," he said softly. He paused long enough for discomfort to return, long enough for tension to settle into every corner of the room, and then he stopped, the sentence unfinished, the silence unbroken. The host stared at him. The audience waited. The cameras kept rolling, and in that moment, no one realized yet that the mockery had already failed. The silence finally broke, but not from Bob Marley. It came from the audience. Not applause, not laughter. A sound much rarer on live television. Emotion. Someone in the front row wiped their eyes. Another person lowered their head. A woman near the aisle clasped her hands together, as if she had just heard something deeply personal. The host noticed it too. He straightened in his chair, suddenly aware that the room was no longer on his side. "Well," he said quickly, forcing energy into his voice. "That was unexpected." Bob remained seated, calm as ever. The host glanced toward the cameras, then back to Bob. "You're very comfortable with silence," he said, trying to regain footing. Bob smiled softly. "Silence is where people hear themselves," he replied. That was it. The balance shifted. The host laughed, but it came out hollow. "You know," he said, "we invited you here thinking tonight would be entertaining." Bob nodded gently. "It is," he said. "Just not in the way you planned." The audience reacted immediately. A few soft claps began, then more joined, not loud, not wild. Respectful. The host raised his hands. All right, he said. "Let's not turn this into a lecture." Bob looked at him kindly. "I didn't," he said. "You did." The applause grew louder now. The host froze for half a second. Then he did something no one expected. Stopped smiling. "You know," he said slowly, "I thought tonight I would expose something." Bob listened. "But I think," the host continued, voice quieter now, "I exposed myself instead." The studio went still again. The host took a breath. "I came into this interview ready to challenge you," he said. "Maybe even embarrass you." He looked directly at Bob, "and instead, you didn't fight me. You didn't insult me. You didn't even defend yourself." Bob's expression remained peaceful. "You let the silence do it," the host said. Bob nodded once. The host turned to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice unsteady, "I owe our guest an apology." Gasps filled the room. "I mistook calm for weakness," he admitted, "and I mistook difference for something that needed mocking." He looked back at Bob. That was wrong. The applause erupted now, real, full, emotional. Bob stood up slowly, not triumphantly, respectfully. He extended his hand. The host hesitated, then took it. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Bob said quietly, "We are all learning." The host nodded, eyes glistening. "Yes," he said, "we are." The host cleared his throat, turning back to the camera. "We're going to end tonight differently than we planned," he said. "Bob Marley has agreed to stay and share his music with us." The audience rose to their feet. Bob picked up his guitar. No announcement. No Introduction. He began to play softly. A song about unity, about peace, about humanity. The room transformed. Crew members stopped working. Camera operators forgot framing. Even the host sat back silent, listening. When the song ended, no one clapped at first. They were too moved. Then the applause came, thunderous, grateful, overwhelming. The episode ended moments later, but the impact didn't. Single quotes. The next morning, newspapers ran headlines about the interview that changed the tone of live television. Viewers wrote letters, not complaints, but thanks. The clip spread, not because of controversy, but because of dignity. Years later, the host would admit in an interview that night changed him. "I thought power came from control," he said. "Bob showed me power comes from restraint." And Bob Marley? He never spoke about the moment publicly. He didn't need to, because the truth had already been captured on camera. They invited him to mock him. Instead, they exposed themselves, and the world saw it.